It is said that in the years when the roads of Persia were still carried by the dust of caravans, and the silence of long desert sea, a wandering dervish named Yunis was seen passing through cities and forgotten villages, never staying long enough for his shadow to become familiar, yet long enough for his presence to be remembered like the faint scent of incense in an empty room. The old men of Shiraz still remember how travelers once spoke of him in hushed voices, as if speaking too loudly might dissolve the memory of his passing. He was not a man of wealth or rank, but one whose gaze seemed to carry the weight of distant thoughts, as though he had once listened too deeply to the sorrow of the world, and never fully returned from it. In those days, it is told, Yunis arrived near the outskirts of a city, where gardens were said to bloom even in late autumn, a place whispered about among travelers as the Garden of Eternal Youth, not because time did not pass there, but because those who entered often forgot how to measure it. The garden belonged to no king in particular, though some claimed it had once been tended by poets who believed that beauty, once spoken, must be preserved in living form. Yunis came there not as a seeker of wonder, but as one who had grown weary of wonder itself, for he had seen too many faces change too quickly in the mirror of years. Too many voices fade into memory like footsteps in sand. At the gate of the garden he paused, not in awe but in quiet hesitation, as if asking whether beauty that refuses to fade is a blessing or another kind of sorrow. The keeper of the garden, an old man with hands stained by soil and time, recognized something in Yunis that was not youth nor age, but a patient understanding of both. He allowed him to enter without question, as if some visitors are not to be stopped but only witnessed. Inside, the air was filled with the scent of pomegranate blossoms and damp earth, and water channels moved slowly through stone paths, like veins carrying memory rather than water. It is said that Yunis walked without haste, observing how the flowers seemed unchanged by seasons, yet how the eyes of those who tended them carried the subtle exhaustion of repetition. Among the gardeners he met a young man whose face appeared untouched by years, yet whose silence carried the heaviness of someone who had spoken too often and found no lasting answer in words. The young man spoke softly, saying that people came from distant lands believing they could steal youth from the garden, but what they carried away instead was the awareness of how quickly it slips even in places where it seems preserved. Yunis listened without interruption, as he often did, for he believed that every human voice contains a truth that reveals itself only when not pursued. As evening approached, the light within the garden changed, not dimming but deepening, as though the sun itself had grown thoughtful. The keeper of the garden invited Yunis to rest near a pool, where water reflected not only faces, but the quiet movements of thought behind them. There Yunis saw his own reflection, not as altered or miraculous, but as familiar and distant at once, like a memory he could not place. It is said that in that moment he understood something he had long suspected, that youth is not a possession of the body, nor is age merely its decline, but both are ways in which time speaks through the human form. The night grew heavier, and somewhere beyond the walls of the garden, the sounds of the city faded into a distant murmur, replaced by the faint presence of a reed flute carried by wind or imagination. No one could tell. Yunis did not ask for permission to stay longer, nor did he declare intention to leave, for those who walk without attachment often move as naturally as breath. The garden, in its quiet refusal to change, seemed to observe him in return, as if recognizing a traveler who carried his own impermanence more honestly than its illusion of eternal youth. And so the first night passed with Yunis seated beside the water, listening not to speech, but to the slow unfolding silence between thoughts, while the garden of eternal youth continued to bloom around him without promise and without end. It is said that when dawn returned to the garden of eternal youth, it did not arrive with sudden light but with a slow unfolding, as if even the morning hesitated to disturb what the night had carefully preserved. Yunis remained by the water's edge, where he had sat through the silence of hours that no one counted, and the reflection before him now held the pale memory of stars fading into a sky that seemed uncertain whether to become day. The keeper of the garden approached without sound, as those who have spent long years among plants often learn to move like the earth itself, gentle and unintrusive, and he placed beside Yunis a simple cup of tea, dark and warm, without speaking of its origin or meaning. It is said that Yunis accepted it not as hospitality alone, but as acknowledgment, for in places like this, even small gestures carry the weight of understanding. Around them, the gardeners began their quiet work, tending to roses that did not seem to age yet, whose fragrance still deepened and softened like human emotion rather than botanical certainty. The young gardener from the previous evening returned, his presence marked not by youth itself, but by the strange stillness of one who has observed too much repetition in what others call wonder. He sat at a distance at first, as if unsure whether time permitted familiarity between those who question it and those who tend it. Eventually he spoke again, not with urgency, but with the careful tone of someone who has learned that words do not return once released. He said that people often imagine the garden as a place where nothing fades, but in truth, it is only a place where fading happens so slowly that the eye forgets how to recognize it. Yunis listened, and the silence that followed was not emptiness but a shared understanding that did not require correction. It is told that later that morning Yunis walked deeper into the garden, passing stone paths, where water flowed with steady patience, and he noticed how even in this place of preserved beauty, there were signs of repetition in the faces of those who tended it, as if the human heart cannot escape its own seasons, even when the world around it pretends otherwise. He encountered an elderly woman arranging flowers with hands that trembled slightly, not from weakness alone, but from the long practice of arranging the same beauty day after day. And she told him without looking up that she had seen many come seeking youth, but few ever asked what becomes of memory when nothing changes. Yunis did not answer, for he had learned that some questions are not meant to be resolved, but carried. As the sun climbed higher, the garden revealed its quiet paradox more clearly, for its perfection did not feel like freedom but like a carefully held breath that had never been allowed to release. In the afternoon, a faint music began to drift through the air. A reed flute played somewhere beyond sight, not performed for an audience, but for the space itself, and its notes did not suggest celebration, but remembrance. The young gardener eventually joined Yunis along a shaded corridor of vines, and together they walked without speaking for a long time, until the young man finally admitted that he no longer knew whether he was tending the garden, or whether the garden was tending him, shaping his days into forms he could not distinguish from his own thoughts. Yunis responded only after a long pause, saying softly that those who remain too long among unchanging things may begin to mistake stillness for truth, and truth, like water, must be allowed to move in order to remain itself. The young man looked toward the distant trees, their leaves unmoving in the warm air, and for a moment something like longing crossed his face, not for youth, but for the simple passage of time that gives meaning to change. As evening approached once again, the garden began to dim into shades of amber and shadow, and Yunis returned to the pool where he had sat before, though it seemed different now, as if even water remembers the weight of observation. The keeper of the garden stood nearby, watching without intrusion, and it is said that in that silence there was an unspoken recognition between two men who understood that eternity, when made visible, does not always resemble peace. Yunis remained there until the first stars appeared, not as signs of wonder, but as reminders of distance. And in that moment he felt the strange awareness that even places called eternal are still bound to the way they are remembered by those who leave them. The night deepened again, and the garden continued its quiet existence, neither offering answers nor asking questions, while Yunis remained caught between the beauty of what does not change and the sorrow of what does not move on. It is said that on the third day Yunis did not wake with certainty of whether time had passed in the usual sense, or whether the garden itself had folded the hours into one long continuous breath, for within the walls of the garden of eternal youth even dawn and dusk seemed to hesitate before declaring themselves. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of wet stone and blossoms that never seemed to surrender their fullness, and somewhere in the distance the reed flute sounded again, not closer nor farther, but present in a way that suggested it had always been there, waiting to be noticed rather than played. Yunis stood and walked slowly, as he always did, not out of aimlessness, but because haste had long ago lost its meaning for him, and it is said that, as he moved through the narrow paths, he began to feel something subtle yet unsettling, not sorrow exactly, but a quiet questioning of whether a place without change can still be called alive, or whether life itself depends on the permission to become something else. He encountered the young gardener once more near a row of cypress trees, and this time the young man did not speak immediately, as if words themselves had become heavier after days of repetition. Eventually he said that he had begun to notice small differences in the garden, that others refused to acknowledge a leaf slightly less bright, a shadow resting a little longer than it had the day before, and when he spoke of these things the older gardener smiled as though he were forgetting how to see. Yunis listened, and it is told that in his silence there was neither agreement nor denial, only the presence of someone who understands that perception itself is shaped by longing. Together they walked toward the outer edge of the garden, where the stone paths became less carefully maintained, and there the air felt less protected, as if the world beyond the walls still remembered how to age openly. The young man confessed almost in a whisper that he no longer knew whether the garden preserved youth or merely delayed the recognition of its passing, and that thought, once planted in him, had begun to grow like an unwelcome truth that cannot be removed without tearing something essential. Yunis stopped beside a narrow channel of water and looked into it for a long time, and it is said that in his reflection he did not see transformation but continuity, the same face shaped by different distances of light, and he spoke softly, saying that perhaps youth is not the absence of age, but the inability to recognize its arrival. The keeper of the garden appeared again as if he had always been near, but never interrupting, and he observed them with the calm patience of someone who has heard every question before it was fully formed. He said nothing at first, but eventually he spoke of travelers who come believing they are searching for eternal youth, when in truth they are searching for relief from memory, with the burden of remembering how quickly moments become irretrievable. As the day moved toward its final hours, Yunis felt a subtle heaviness in the garden, not of decay but of awareness, as if beauty itself had become conscious of being observed too long. He walked alone for a while, passing under arches of vines and beside pools that reflected both sky and thought, and it is said that he began to understand something that could not be spoken directly, that a place preserved from change may also be preserved from release from the natural forgiveness that time offers to all things by allowing them to end. When evening came, the young gardener found him again, and this time his voice carried a different tone, quieter and more resolved, and he said that he would leave the garden at dawn, even if no one else understood why. Yunis did not ask him to stay or to reconsider, for he knew that departure is sometimes the only form of clarity left to a heart that has seen too much repetition. The night gathered slowly, and the garden as always remained beautiful in its refusal to fade, yet beneath that beauty there was now a presence of distance, as though even perfection had begun to notice the weight of its own endurance. Before dawn, Yunis returned once more to the pool where he had first sat, and the water was still, reflecting neither urgency nor answer, only the quiet fact of being. The keeper of the garden stood at a distance, and for the first time it is said that his expression held something like fatigue, not of body but of witnessing. When the first light of morning approached, Yunis turned toward the gate, and as he walked the garden did not stop him, nor did it call him back, for such places do not hold travelers by force but by the memory they leave behind. It is said that as he crossed the threshold Yunis did not look back immediately, but when he finally did the garden appeared unchanged, as if it had never known his presence at all, and yet within him it had already begun to fade in a different way, not into disappearance but into understanding. And travelers once spoke of a wandering dervish seen again on the road beyond the city, carrying no possession except silence, and those who met him said that his eyes held neither regret nor desire for what he had seen, only the calm awareness that everything beautiful must also be allowed to pass, even the places that pretend they do not.